Hello students and welcome to Chapter 19, the chapter on international trade. I'll be introducing to you the two main figures, figure 19.1 and 19.2, analyzing trade and tariffs, and what we're going to use to analyze it with. Good old-fashioned supply and demand. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about a world without trade. Okay, so let's just set up a normal demand and supply curve here. Okay, so we got our price and our quantity, and we're going to give this market a name from the book, quantity of semiconductors. Okay. All right, then we'll throw in a demand curve. Markers here. More solid demand curve there. And a supply curve. Okay. And as you remember from chapter 4, this will be our equilibrium. Okay. This is our price with no trade. And I'm going to put in a little NT here, where NT means no trade. And then we're going to have our quantity under no trade. And since this is our domestic market, okay, where there's no trade, and that's going to give us a price with no trade, a quantity no trade, we're going to call this domestic supply and domestic demand. Okay. Now we want to introduce trade here, and we're going to talk about the effects of free trade from this starting point. Okay, so we're going to make a couple of assumptions here. We're going to assume that the domestic market is not the lowest cost producers of semiconductors. In fact, foreign producers can produce it for much cheaper. We're also going to assume that the amount of domestic demand is not going to affect the price of semiconductors in the world. So basically, like, this domestic market is a small drop in the overall world market for semiconductors. This allows us to make a world supply curve that is flat, okay? And so we put in this flat world supply curve. We could just call this world supply. And because the demand is relatively small to the overall world demand, basically this is the equilibrium price for the world, and domestic consumers can buy as much as they want to at that world equilibrium price shown in a different graph. Okay. All right. So if we allow free trade to take place, then too, the domestic suppliers will also have to accept this world price. Okay. And so I'm going to do a new acronym, FT, which equals free trade. Okay. And so here's our price with free trade. Okay. Now, this is where we add a little bit of complexity here, okay, because prior to trade, the quantity supplied equaled the quantity demanded domestically. However, now that the price is below what the domestic equilibrium price would be, the suppliers are not going to be willing and able to supply as much as before because of this foreign competition. And so the price would go down, okay, And so the first effect you're going to see is the price is going to fall, okay? And the quantity supplied domestically is going to fall, okay? And so this is the new quantity supplied under free trade, okay? All right, now what is that going to do to producer surplus? Producer surplus is going to fall because they were previously able to receive a P&T, price with no trade, and they were able to produce more because of the higher price. Well, now with the lower price, this producer surplus shrinks from this triangle to this triangle. Okay, so remember, producer surplus is the area above the supply curve, below the price that sellers receive, okay, and to the left of the quantity supplied. Okay, all right, so in this case, price falls, quantity supplied falls, and the producer surplus falls. All right, now let's turn to the consumer side, okay? Well, with a higher price, consumers like lower prices, and so when the price falls from the no trade price to the free trade price, the quantity demanded increases, and so where the world supply intersects the domestic demand curve, that would tell us the quantity demanded under free trade. Okay? So under this situation, the quantity demanded increases. Okay. All right. Now what about consumer surplus? Okay. Well, previously it was this triangle right here, the area above the price buyers pay, underneath the maximum price that they're willing to pay, represented by the demand curve, and to the left of the quantity that they purchase, okay? Well, this triangle is now expanded to this larger triangle right here that I am bordering. And so consumer surplus goes up, all right? So under free trade, domestic producers lose, domestic consumers win. Well, what about market gains from trade? Well, you can see that the producer surplus went down, the consumer surplus went up, but the overall gains from trade are going to be larger because before it was this triangle that made up the market gains from trade, but now we have this combination of the consumer surplus plus the producer surplus. And so market surplus will go up. Okay. All right. Now, here's the problem. We've got not just economists making these decisions. We got domestic producers trying to influence politicians to give them some form of protectionism. Okay. And so these domestic producers of semiconductors successfully lobby to the government to get some type of protection. And they successfully get a tariff enacted. Okay. And so what I'm going to show you now is the fact that this tariff is a tax on imports, okay? And just to rewind back a little bit, I'll go ahead and label this world supply with the tariff. Okay. Before the tariff was enacted, this was the domestic production and this remainder was made up by imports. Okay? All right, so what happens when we introduce the tariff? Okay, so now the world supply with tariff, that will push the price back up to this price, little t, which is what I'm going to call the tariff. Okay. All right, so we follow this new price under the tariff, okay, which is basically the free trade price plus the actual per unit tariff, okay, and we are going to see that the domestic supply is going to increase because now more of these units of production are affordable. Okay, and so just to make a little extra space, this is the quantity supplied under the tariff. Okay, so the first effect is that the price goes up and the quantity supplied domestically goes up. Okay, and producer surplus, you guessed it, increases. Okay, so this was the producer surplus after free trade, but then with this protectionism, their producer surplus expands to that triangle. All right. What about the consumers? Well, the consumers now have to pay a higher price. And so when that new price, world price plus the tariff, PT, crosses the demand curve, this gives us our new quantity demanded under tariffs. Okay? And so this tiny amount right here are the imports with the tariff. Okay. So one thing that's going to happen is the domestic quantity demand is going to decrease. Our imports will also decrease. What will happen to consumer surplus? Well, here's the triangle before with free trade, now with the tariff. That goes up there, okay? And so we have a reduction in consumer surplus. So consumer surplus increases. Our so the question that's left over is, where does the rest of the gains from trade go? Okay? All right, so we saw that with free trade, the market surplus increased. Okay? So we know that before, the market surplus was this large triangle plus the which was consumer surplus, plus the producer surplus triangle. Okay. Well, this is the new producer surplus. This is the new consumer surplus. And so what's left over is this region right here. All right. So where do those gains from trade go to? Well, a tariff is a tax, okay? And so the tax revenue that the domestic government receives is the per unit tariff times the number of imports. Okay, so it would be this rectangle right here. Okay, so we have tariff revenue. Okay, and that's equal to the tariff per unit tariff times the number of imports. Okay. And then we've got, so we're going to call this the first piece. So put a little 1 there. Okay. Then we've got the second piece. Okay. And this is what we call wasted resources. And those wasted resources are represented by the fact that the world, foreign producers, could have produced these units between here and here at a lower cost than the domestic suppliers. And so we have effectively wasted resources that could have gone to produce something else within this country. Okay. The third effect, unrealized gains from trade. Okay. What does this mean? Well, this means that there are buyers who had a higher value for producing the good, they had a higher value for consuming the good than producers had to make the good. And so what that means is the marginal benefit is greater than the marginal cost. The juice was worth the squeeze, it's just that it was illegal to squeeze the juice. Okay, and so these are trades that were made illegal basically because of the tariff, and these are unrealized gains from trade. So both 2 and 3 represent gains from trade that go to no one. And so those are what we would call a dead weight loss. Okay, it just goes to nobody. Okay, so as a result, some of the market surplus was transferred over to the government, but because of 2 and 3, market surplus goes down. So society is worse off as a whole because of this tariff. The only person made better off is the domestic producers and maybe the government. But of course, there's no guarantee that that tax revenue will be spent efficiently. Okay, so there are effects of free trade, are effects of tariffs, shown on one graph, figure 19.1 and 19.2 put together. Thank you.